Naomi Thompson was exhausted after another long shift at the hospital. As a trauma surgeon, she was no stranger to late nights and early mornings, but today it felt particularly grueling. She rubbed her tired eyes as she drove down the empty highway, grateful that the traffic was light. All she wanted was to get home, kick off her shoes, and collapse into bed. But just as she turned a corner, Naomi's headlights caught something up ahead. A car had veered off the road, crashed into the guardrail. The front of the vehicle was crushed, steam rising from the engine. Her heart skipped a beat. Instinct took over as she quickly pulled over to the side of the road and jumped out of her car. She rushed toward the wreckage, her mind racing through the possibilities. Someone might be hurt. Someone might be dying. Naomi wasn't on duty, but that didn't matter. A doctor never really stops being a doctor. As she approached the car, she could see a man slumped over the steering wheel. His face was pale, and he wasn't moving. Her training kicked in. "Sir, can you hear me?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. No response. Naomi quickly checked the pulse on his neck, weak but present. She breathed a small sigh of relief. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, giving the dispatcher her location and explaining the situation. "I'm a doctor," she said. "The man is unconscious, and it looks like he's lost a lot of blood. Send an ambulance right away." The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way, but Naomi knew every second counted. She pulled her medical kit from the trunk of her car, something she always kept on hand, and began tending to the man. His leg was pinned under the dashboard, and blood was pooling on the floor of the car. She worked as quickly as she could, using a tourniquet to slow the bleeding while keeping an eye on his breathing. The sirens were getting closer now, but Naomi didn't look up. She was too focused on her patient, her hands moving with precision despite the adrenaline surging through her. She had done this 1,000 times before, but out here in the dark, without the safety of her hospital and her team, everything felt more urgent, more personal. Finally, the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles illuminated the scene. Paramedics rushed over to help, and Naomi stepped back to give them space, explaining what she had done so far. "He needs to be stabilized immediately, and his leg might require surgery," she told them, her voice calm but firm. That's when she noticed 2 police officers approaching her, both white men in their early 40s. Their expressions were stern, almost suspicious, as they looked her up and down. Naomi's stomach tightened, but she pushed the feeling aside. There was no time for that right now. One of the officers, his voice gruff, spoke first. "What are you doing here?" Naomi frowned, confused by the tone. "I'm a doctor. I stopped to help." The officer glanced at the paramedics, then back at Naomi, narrowing his eyes. "You need to step back. This is a police matter now." She blinked in disbelief. "A police matter? This man is critically injured. I'm just trying to save his life." The other officer, taller and broader, crossed his arms over his chest. "We don't need civilians interfering with our work. Step aside." Naomi's heart began to pound, a mix of frustration and anger bubbling to the surface. "I'm not a civilian. I'm a medical professional. I called this in, and I've been administering first aid until the paramedics arrived." But the officers weren't listening. Their eyes were cold, and Naomi could feel the shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't about the accident anymore. It was about her, something she had experienced before but never wanted to acknowledge. The sting of racism was subtle but unmistakable. The taller officer moved closer. "Step away now, or we'll have to remove you." Naomi felt her pulse quicken. How could they not see what she was doing? She had saved this man's life, but all they saw was a black woman standing where, in their minds, she didn't belong. Naomi took a deep breath, fighting the urge to argue. She had seen this type of situation before. The subtle shift in tone, the cold stares, the unspoken judgment. As much as it infuriated her, she knew that escalating the situation wouldn't help anyone, least of all the injured man who still needed medical attention. The paramedics were busy loading him onto a stretcher, but she could see the worry in their eyes as they glanced between her and the police officers. It was clear they were aware of the tension building, but no one said anything. The air around them felt heavy, almost stifling, as the officers stepped closer. "Look, I've done what I can," Naomi said, trying to keep her voice calm. "The paramedics are taking over now. But this man wouldn't have made it if I hadn't stopped." The shorter officer, whose name tag read Henderson, gave a dismissive shrug. "That's not your call to make, ma'am. You should have stayed in your car and let us handle it." Naomi bit back a sharp retort, her hands clenching a fist at her sides as she tried to keep her frustration in check. She wanted to scream that she was a doctor, not some bystander meddling where she didn't belong. But she knew that wouldn't change their perception of her. In their eyes, she was just another black woman who they saw as a threat, no matter what uniform she wore or what degrees she had earned. "I'm just trying to do my job," she said instead, her voice steady but strained. Henderson's partner, Officer Brady, raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Your job is to stay out of the way and let us handle this. Now, step back before we have to take you in for interfering with a police investigation." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. Take her in? Was this really happening? She could feel the anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Losing control now could only make things worse. The paramedics had finished loading the man into the ambulance, but they hesitated for a moment, looking back at her with a mix of sympathy and uncertainty. One of them, a young woman with dark brown hair pulled back into a ponytail, mouthed a silent "thank you" before hurrying to the front of the vehicle. The ambulance doors slammed shut, the siren blared, and within seconds it was gone, leaving Naomi standing there, feeling utterly alone. Officer Brady stepped forward, pulling out a small notepad. "I'm going to need to see some ID," he said flatly. Naomi blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he replied, a cold edge to his voice. "ID now." Her mind raced. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had saved someone's life, for God's sake. But she knew how these situations could spiral. She reached into her pocket, slowly pulling out her driver's license and her hospital ID, handing them over with a shaky hand. Brady snatched the cards from her, glancing at them briefly before turning to his partner. "Looks like she's some kind of doctor after all." Henderson shrugged, clearly unimpressed. "That doesn't give her the right to interfere in a police matter." Naomi's blood boiled. This wasn't about police work. It was about saving a life. That man was bleeding out. "If I hadn't..." Brady cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "We'll be the ones to decide what's necessary. Now, sit tight while we run your information." He walked back to the squad car, leaving Naomi standing there in the middle of the road, her pulse pounding in her ears. It was as if her entire existence had been reduced to that one moment, standing helplessly under the scrutiny of these officers. Despite everything she had accomplished, everything she had done that night to save a life. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Naomi glanced down the road, her car still parked on the shoulder, the scene of the accident behind her now cleared. But here she was, stuck in the middle of it, being treated like a suspect rather than a good Samaritan. Finally, after what felt like hours, Brady returned. He handed her ID back without a word, his expression unreadable. Naomi waited for him to say something, anything, but he just turned away, walking back toward Henderson. "You're free to go," was all Henderson muttered as he turned on his heel, following Brady back to the car. Naomi stood there for a moment, stunned. That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had just happened, of how they had treated her. Just an abrupt dismissal, like she didn't matter. She clenched her jaw, fighting back tears of frustration. There were no words for the humiliation, for the injustice of it all. And yet, as much as she wanted to yell, to fight back, she knew that wasn't an option. Not here. Not now. Without another word, Naomi turned and walked back to her car. The night was still, the road eerily quiet, but inside her, a storm was brewing. Naomi sat in her car for a long moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she tried to steady herself. The incident had left her shaken, not just by the blatant disrespect, but by the stark reminder that no matter what she accomplished in life, there would always be those who saw her skin color first. She stared out at the empty road, the events replaying in her mind, the way the officers had dismissed her so casually, how they had made her feel like she didn't belong, like she was in the wrong, even when she had done nothing but help. Her heart still pounded with the frustration of it all. But underneath that, a steely resolve began to form. Naomi knew she couldn't let this moment define her. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to be deterred by their ignorance. Being a doctor meant everything to her. Saving lives, making a difference. It was the reason she got up every morning. She couldn't allow these two officers to strip away her sense of purpose. As she started the engine, she took a deep breath and reminded herself of all the people she had helped throughout her career, all the lives she had touched. Tonight was no different, she thought. She had saved a life, and that was what truly mattered. Back at the hospital the next morning, the familiar routine was a welcome distraction from the previous night's ordeal. Naomi walked briskly through the halls, greeting nurses and doctors, her white coat fluttering behind her. The busy rhythm of the hospital had a way of pulling her focus back to what really mattered, her patients. But as she made her way to the trauma unit, a voice behind her called out, "Dr. Bennett." She turned to see her colleague, Dr. Williams, hurrying to catch up with her. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, with a calm, steady presence that always seemed to ground those around him. "I heard about last night," he said, falling into step beside her. Naomi's stomach twisted slightly. Word traveled fast in the hospital, especially when it came to incidents outside of work. "Yeah, it was something," she said, keeping her tone neutral as they walked down the corridor. Dr. Williams glanced at her, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Are you okay? I mean, those cops had no business treating you like that." Naomi appreciated his support, but she wasn't ready to dive into the details, especially not here, in the middle of her shift. She shrugged it off, offering him a small smile. "I'm fine. Just one of those things, you know?" He didn't look entirely convinced, but let it go. "Well, if you ever need to talk about it, I'm here." Naomi nodded, grateful for his offer, but she wasn't ready to unpack everything just yet. The weight of what had happened was still fresh, and she needed time to process it on her own terms. As they reached the trauma unit, she quickly shifted the conversation. "So, what's on the docket today?" Dr. Williams accepted the change of subject and handed her a tablet with the morning's cases. "We've got a busy day ahead. 3 post-op patients, and there's a possible cardiac trauma coming in later this afternoon." Naomi scanned the list, her mind clicking into place as she focused on the work ahead. It was easier this way, to bury herself in her responsibilities and let the hospital's steady rhythm drown out the lingering frustration from last night. But as the day went on, she couldn't completely shake the feeling of injustice. Each time she passed a police officer at the hospital, whether they were escorting a patient or handling a routine checkup, her mind flashed back to the confrontation on the road. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced the same kind of treatment, how many had been dismissed, silenced, or worse, simply because of the color of their skin. By the end of her shift, as Naomi was packing up her things in the staff room, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let this go. Maybe she couldn't change what had happened to her, but she could use her voice to make sure it didn't happen to someone else. She pulled out her phone and opened her contacts. Scrolling down to a familiar name, she hesitated for a moment, then hit call. "Rachel?" "Hey, it's Naomi," she said when the line picked up. "I need your help with something." Rachel was a civil rights lawyer and an old friend from college. If anyone could help Naomi figure out what to do next, it was her. Rachel's voice on the other end of the line was as familiar as it was reassuring. They hadn't spoken in months, but their bond ran deep, built on years of shared experiences and a mutual understanding of the challenges that came with being a Black woman in professions that weren't always welcoming. "Naomi, it's been a while. What's going on?" Rachel's voice was warm, but Naomi could hear the concern behind it. Naomi leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment as she collected her thoughts. This wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but it was one she needed to have. She couldn't just move on without addressing what had happened, not when it still gnawed at her day and night. "There's something I need to talk to you about," Naomi began, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "I had an incident last night, an encounter with the police while I was responding to an accident." Rachel's tone shifted instantly. "What happened?" Naomi recounted the events of the night. The confrontation with the officers, the way they had dismissed her despite her attempts to help, and how they had treated her as though she were the one at fault. As she spoke, she could feel the anger bubbling up again, but she kept her voice controlled. "Rachel, I'm not just angry about what happened. I feel like I need to do something about it. I can't let them get away with treating me or anyone else like that." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Rachel finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "Naomi, this is serious. Police misconduct, racial profiling, it's all too common. If you want to pursue this, you're looking at filing a formal complaint, maybe even a lawsuit. But it won't be easy. Are you sure you want to go down that road?" Naomi nodded, even though Rachel couldn't see her. "I've thought about it all day, and yes, I want to hold them accountable, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been in my shoes. It's not just about me being a doctor. It's about the principle." Rachel sighed softly. "Okay, if you're really serious about this, I'll help you. We'll start by documenting everything, every detail you can remember. Then we'll go through the proper channels to file the complaint. It's going to take time, but I've got your back." A sense of relief washed over Naomi. For the first time since the incident, she felt like she was taking control of the situation. With Rachel by her side, she wasn't alone in this fight. "Thank you," Naomi said, her voice full of gratitude. "I really appreciate it." Rachel's tone lightened slightly. "No need to thank me. You've got every right to stand up for yourself. And trust me, we'll make sure your voice is heard." As the weeks passed, Naomi and Rachel worked together to build the case. Naomi relived every painful detail of that night, recounting it over and over, but with each retelling, she felt a little more empowered. This wasn't just about her anger anymore. It was about justice, about making sure those officers couldn't treat someone else the way they had treated her. But it wasn't easy. Every step of the process felt like an uphill battle. The police department was slow to respond to their inquiries, and when they did, it was with bureaucratic indifference. The officers in question denied any wrongdoing, claiming that they had acted within the bounds of their duties. They twisted the narrative, painting Naomi as someone who had overstepped, who had interfered in their work. Naomi sat in Rachel's office one afternoon, staring at the latest letter from the police department. Her frustration was palpable. "How do they get away with this?" she muttered, tossing the paper onto the desk. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "It's the system, Naomi. It's designed to protect them, to make it hard for people like us to fight back. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. It just means we have to be smarter, more persistent." Naomi sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I just want them to understand that what they did was wrong. I'm not asking for much, just an acknowledgement." Rachel looked at her, her eyes steady. "We'll get there. It's going to take time, but we'll get there." As they continued to navigate the legal process, Naomi found herself becoming more outspoken. She began talking to other doctors and professionals who had faced similar encounters with the police, sharing her story with a growing sense of purpose. She attended meetings, spoke at community events, and slowly, her voice became part of a larger conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, Naomi received a message from Rachel. "Good news. They've agreed to an internal investigation." Naomi's heart skipped a beat as she read the words. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a step in the right direction, a sign that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. As the internal investigation began, Naomi tried to focus on her work, but the events of that night stayed with her like a weight she couldn't shake. Every time she put on her white coat, she was reminded of how quickly her profession and identity had been dismissed. The investigation was a small victory, but she knew it was only the beginning of a long and exhausting process. Days turned into weeks, and Naomi found herself constantly wondering if anything would come from the investigation. Would they really hold those officers accountable, or would they sweep it under the rug, just as they had done so many times before? One afternoon, as Naomi was in the middle of a shift at the hospital, she received a call from Rachel. Stepping into a quiet corner, she answered, her heart pounding. "Naomi, we've got a problem," Rachel said, her voice serious. Naomi felt her stomach drop. "What happened?" "They're dragging their feet on the investigation. We've been stonewalled at every turn, and it's clear they're not taking this seriously. They're treating it like a formality, something they have to do but don't really care about." Naomi leaned against the wall, her frustration boiling over. "So, what do we do now?" Rachel hesitated for a moment. "I think it's time to go public." The thought of taking her story to the public was daunting. Naomi wasn't the type to seek the spotlight, and she certainly didn't want to become a symbol for a cause she hadn't asked to be a part of. But as Rachel explained the potential impact of going public, how it could put pressure on the police department and force them to take the investigation seriously, Naomi knew it was the right thing to do. A week later, Naomi found herself sitting in front of a camera for a local news station, telling her story to a reporter. She spoke about the night of the accident, the way the officers had treated her, and the uphill battle she'd faced in seeking justice. Her voice was calm, but beneath the surface, she felt the weight of what this moment represented. As the interview aired, Naomi received an outpouring of support from the community. Colleagues, friends, and even strangers reached out to express their solidarity, sharing their own experiences with police discrimination. It was overwhelming, but it also gave Naomi strength. She realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been in her position. Despite the growing attention on her case, the police department remained frustratingly silent. Weeks passed without any updates on the investigation, and Naomi began to feel the familiar weight of helplessness creeping back in. She had done everything right, followed the proper channels, told her story, put herself out there, but still, it seemed like justice was slipping through her fingers. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, sifting through emails and paperwork, Naomi received a call from a name she hadn't expected to see: Officer Jenkins. For a moment, she just stared at her phone, unsure if she should even answer. Why was one of the officers from that night calling her now? What could he possibly have to say? Taking a deep breath, she answered, "This is Naomi." There was a long pause on the other end before Jenkins finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Dr. Naomi, I wanted to apologize." Naomi gripped her phone tightly, unsure of what to say. Officer Jenkins' apology felt like a jarring contrast to the silence and avoidance she had experienced from the department for weeks. His voice on the other end of the line sounded sincere, but Naomi had trouble trusting anything from the officers who had put her through that nightmare. "I know an apology isn't enough," Jenkins continued, his voice filled with discomfort. "But I've been thinking about that night a lot, and I realize we handled things horribly. I didn't recognize you as a doctor. I didn't respect you, and I let my own assumptions get in the way. I'm truly sorry." Naomi took a moment to collect her thoughts before speaking. "It's not just about that night," she said, her voice measured. "It's about the system you're a part of. You're one officer, but this problem is bigger than you. I appreciate you calling, but an apology doesn't erase the fact that this happens to people like me every day." "I understand," Jenkins said quietly. "I can't change the past, but I wanted to say something, even if it's not enough. I know the department is dragging its feet, and that's wrong. You deserve justice, Dr. Naomi." Naomi appreciated the gesture, but she remained guarded. It was hard to reconcile the man on the phone with the officer who had disrespected her so thoroughly. After a brief exchange, she ended the call, feeling conflicted. Was this a genuine attempt at reconciliation, or just a way for him to ease his own guilt? The apology weighed heavily on Naomi's mind, but she didn't have much time to dwell on it. The days ahead were filled with more media appearances and meetings with Rachel, strategizing how to keep the pressure on the police department. The investigation had stalled, but Naomi refused to let it be swept aside. She had come too far, and the support she received from the public strengthened her resolve. One morning, as Naomi was preparing to leave for the hospital, her phone buzzed with a new email. It was from the city's police review board. The subject line read, "Update on internal investigation." Her heart raced as she opened the email, quickly scanning its contents. The investigation had concluded, and the review board had found that the officers involved had violated department protocol in their treatment of Naomi. There would be disciplinary actions, though the specifics were not outlined in the email. It wasn't the complete justice Naomi had hoped for, but it was something. The officers would face consequences, however small, and her case had brought attention to the need for reform. She forwarded the email to Rachel, knowing they would need to discuss the next steps. But for now, Naomi allowed herself a moment of relief. Later that day, Rachel and Naomi met in a small cafe downtown to talk about the news. Rachel was encouraged by the outcome, though she was quick to point out how much more needed to be done. "It's a victory, but it's not the end," Rachel said, stirring her coffee. "We have to keep pushing. Keep using your story to call for change. This can't just be a one-time thing where they slap the officers on the wrist and move on." Naomi nodded. She knew Rachel was right, but she was exhausted, emotionally, mentally, and physically. "I just want to focus on my work," Naomi admitted. "I never wanted to be in the spotlight like this. I just want to help people." "I know," Rachel said gently. But you're helping people in a different way now. You've shown so many others that it's possible to stand up to injustice and be heard. Naomi sighed, sipping her tea. She appreciated Rachel's encouragement, but the fight had taken its toll on her. Still, as she looked around the cafe, seeing the diverse faces of the city, she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about making sure no one else had to endure what she had. By the end of the week, Naomi received another surprise. This time, it was an official invitation to speak at a citywide forum on police reform. The event was being organized by a coalition of activists, community leaders, and local politicians, and they wanted Naomi to share her experience as part of a larger conversation on racial profiling and systemic change. At first, Naomi hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something she enjoyed, and the idea of standing in front of a large audience to talk about such a personal experience made her nervous. But after discussing it with Rachel and some of her colleagues at the hospital, Naomi decided to accept the invitation. It was an opportunity to use her story for something bigger, to keep the conversation going. The night of the forum arrived quickly. As Naomi stood backstage, waiting for her turn to speak, she felt a mixture of nerves and determination. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about challenging a system that had failed too many for too long. When her name was called, Naomi stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath, looked out at the faces in the audience, and began to speak. Naomi stood at the podium, the spotlight warm on her face. The auditorium was packed with people, community leaders, activists, students, and even a few city officials. As she looked out at the sea of faces, a wave of nervous energy surged through her. This wasn't like being in the operating room, where she was in full control. This was exposing her most vulnerable experience to a crowd, hoping they would understand and feel what she had endured. "I'm not here because I want to be," Naomi began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I'm here because I was forced into a situation that no one should ever have to face. I'm here because I believe that we can't stay silent in the face of injustice." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was completely silent. Every eye focused on her. "I am a doctor. I've spent my career saving lives, helping people in their most desperate moments. But that night on the highway, I wasn't seen as a doctor. I wasn't seen as someone trying to help. I was seen as a problem, as a threat. Because of the color of my skin." Naomi could feel the weight of her story settling over the audience. She recounted the events carefully, describing how she had rushed to help the injured driver, only to be met with hostility from the officers. The humiliation, the fear, the frustration, it all came flooding back as she spoke. But this time, telling the story felt different. It wasn't just reliving a nightmare. It was reclaiming her power. "When I look back on that night, I realized that it wasn't just about me. It was about a system that sees Black people as suspects first, professionals second. It's about a culture that allows officers to act on their biases without accountability. And that's why I'm standing here today, because that system has to change." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Naomi wasn't done yet. As the forum continued, she joined a panel discussion with other speakers, sharing insights and listening to stories from people who had faced similar situations. There were parents who had lost children to police violence, young men and women who had been racially profiled, and community organizers who had spent years fighting for reform. Each story reinforced the importance of Naomi's fight. And though she felt the emotional toll of hearing so much pain, she also felt a sense of solidarity. She wasn't alone in this. The forum wasn't just a place to vent frustrations. It was a call to action. Naomi had never seen herself as an activist, but as she listened to the other panelists and the audience members, she realized that her voice mattered in this movement. Her experience as a doctor gave her a unique perspective, and the platform she had been given allowed her to amplify the voices of others who had been silenced for too long. After the forum, Naomi was approached by a young black woman who introduced herself as a medical student. She looked up to Naomi, not just as a doctor, but as someone who had stood up for herself in the face of injustice. "You're the reason I haven't given up on this path," the student said, her voice filled with admiration. "It's hard sometimes, feeling like you'll always be seen as less, no matter how hard you work. But seeing you speak today, knowing what you've gone through, it gives me hope." Naomi was touched. She had entered the medical field to save lives, but here she was, inspiring someone in a different way. She realized that change didn't only happen in the operating room. It could happen through sharing her story, through standing up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. As the student walked away, Naomi felt a deep sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but she had taken an important step. Her story wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was part of a larger movement, and she was committed to seeing it through. In the weeks that followed the forum, Naomi's life began to settle back into a new kind of normal. The media attention had died down, and the internal investigation into the officer's conduct had led to some reforms within the department, though much more was needed. Naomi continued to work at the hospital, but now she also made time to speak at events and mentor young professionals like the medical student who had approached her at the forum. The case had not only changed Naomi's life, but had also opened up conversations about racial profiling and police reform across the city. It wasn't the ending she had envisioned, but it was a step toward progress. And that, Naomi realized, was all she could hope for. She had come through the storm bruised but unbroken, and now she was using her voice to make sure that others wouldn't have to endure the same pain in silence. Naomi wasn't just a doctor anymore. She was an advocate, a voice for change. And though the road ahead would be long, she was ready to walk it.